Monday, I called it Hurricane Isaiah because I can't say the other name. It came through like that evening, and we were standing on the deck facing the beach, and all these people out on their porches seemed like they were having a hurricane party. Now, it was a Category 1. I think we have some 70-mile-per-hour gust. The interesting thing was the next day, I was able to spend some time talking to just different people, and we bumped into this family of several. They had a daughter and a friend. Anyway, the water from the ocean was not the big deal. It was the water that came from the backside, the sound. And by the time they got a couple of their cars to higher ground, when they got back, their daughter's cars, 2019s, were like underwater up to the steering wheel. And these two daddies were wading through water, Cherry Grove, North Myrtle Beach, up to their chest. I was like, what? And we had gone to bed at 11, so we didn't see that much water, but it came, and it came suddenly. The next 2 or 3 days, I watched these flatbeds come in, and I counted at least 5 flatbeds with 2 to 3 cars each. Audis, Mercedes, Range Rovers, cars, just like, what? And then we received this completely totaled, right? And one of the girls was like a 18-year-old. She was going crazy. Just the night before, she was just hysterical. The next day, Daddy finally calmed her down, and she realized what insurance is all about. And the gap insurance means she's going to get a brand new 2020 or 21. So she was like, she went from doom and gloom to like joy, unexpressible. That morning on Tuesday, someone sent us a video. It's about a 4-minute video, and it was a drone going over Oak Island. I think it took the brunt of the majority. And if any of you saw the main road, it was completely covered in sand. There were cars turned over out in the middle of the road, so the water literally picked those cars up and moved them. And it looked almost like a disaster zone going through Oak Island. But this drone for 4 minutes was flying across, and picking up all these images of cars and stuff. And I was just like, man. And I just thought about the drone and able to see things from a view that you wouldn't see it if we were walking around. But the drone was able to pick up multiple. And I feel like that tonight. It's like we're going to get back in the drone here tonight. And we're going to do this Genesis 1 to 11, ground that we've already covered, but I wonder maybe like lifting up our eyes, we want to see it again. Here's the reason. When you come into the newness of the things that we're dealing with and talking about, if those things are not like riveted and begin to have a clarity to them, we'll miss what we're really after, which is Genesis 12. This is where things are heading. But we've got to get in the drone again tonight, and we want to pick up Genesis 1 to 11. Again, as you remember, we're looking at a period of 2,000 years. I know that's just so odd. I remember back a couple months ago when I saw that, it just hit me again. I was like, no, really, Genesis 1 to 11 is a period of 2,000 years. Because Abraham, Genesis 12, opens up 2000 BC. The garden is 4000 BC. If you're on Roman time or whatever, it's not the Jewish calendar. But I really felt it important. Dave and I talked that we need to get back in and I want us to look at these 3 rebellions again. And I want to draw out a few little thoughts here and there, but mainly I feel like we need to highlight the 3 rebellions from Genesis 3, 6, and 11. So it gives like this complete, drone look so that when we get to Genesis 12, I hope that thing's going to become really clear of what's going on. So that's where I am. in terms of what I just felt like needed to be covered. So let's look at Roman number 1, creation, order, and divine presence. As we peer into the original design of Yahweh in creation, it's crucial to observe the priority and pursuit of maintaining the divine order and God's divine presence in daily life, and it's predicated upon submission and obedience to His commands. So let me try to unpack that for a moment. All through these narratives for 2,000 years, you're going to see rebellion, judgment, promise. Rebellion, judgment, promise. Rebellion, judgment, promise. In other words, God will always be faithful to His word. And He will always come and deal with us. And I know that we have to see this again. We have to see that God, it's almost like this. God doesn't play games. In other words, if we break commandment, He's going to come deal with that. And shouldn't He? This ought to teach us something for young parents. This ought to teach us how we deal with our children. Because if we continue to enable what's going to happen when they get out into life, right? We need to know that God is going to deal with us. So I want us to think through this for just a moment, that God's divine order in the beginning, good. You could even say perfection, although the scriptures don't use that word. They use the word tov. Everything was good, very good. And there's like divine order in the cosmos, in the heavens and upon the earth, among the heavenly host, everything's good. And yet we see these rebellions enter in and begin to bring chaos where God always desired order. And then God drives men and women from His presence. But we want order and presence. I don't want to not have order and the presence of God in my daily life. And so the way we maintain order and presence of God is we live lives of submission and obedience. It really comes down to, are we going to give heed to the prophet? Are we going to give heed to the word of the Lord? All right, so pick up this command. The command for humans was to be fruitful, multiply. Okay? I know, again, I'm covering some ground, but I think it'll be helpful just to think through some of this again. The command for the humans, for Adam and Eve, was to be fruitful and multiply, Genesis 1, Genesis 9. So pre-fall, Genesis 1, and then post-flood, God reiterates the commandment to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. This was God's will, right? Now, here's the problem. You cannot, well, you can, but God desired that it would be Adam and Eve coming together and in that union, even their children having proper union, that they would develop and obviously grow children, right? By the time you get to Genesis 6, when God said be fruitful, multiply, when human beings and divine beings, what's going on? They are coming together in this union that's not sanctioned by God. Both human beings and divine beings, they are transgressing boundaries. The heavens were to be stewarded by these divine beings called the sons of God, and the earth was to be stewarded by human beings, right? But the divine beings were not to come and like cohabitate. We talked about this. Human beings were, but this is what's going on in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. They are transgressing boundaries. God says humans and humans are to be fruitful, multiply. He didn't say humans and divine beings. This is the problem. This is the transgressing of the boundaries, okay? Number two, by the time tonight, this is where we're really heading. When we get to the Tower of Babel, what do? After the flood, Genesis 9, God says, be fruitful, multiply twice. Verse 1, verse 7. And by the time we get to the Tower of Babel, they decide to do what? They decide to gather, not scatter. They decide to be in one location called Babel. Okay, let me go ahead and... Oh, I got a new little... What y'all think about that? We'll get here. I'm not going into all... This is really for later in our teaching. But the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, Egypt, right? Israel, the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea, the land of Israel. This is the region of Babylon, or the original, what we know as the Tower of Babel. Okay? I looked up ziggurat. What would they actually look like? Birthday cake, right? And Egypt would have been like the pyramids. So anyway, just the big idea is this. We're gonna see this in a little bit. This was the region, okay, where they went and where they would have gathered and began building a structure to reach into heavens so that the gods would come and there would be this fellowship with the gods. And again, there's a transgressing of boundaries. And listen, when they're gathering and they're staying in one location, they are omitting the command to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. That's why Babel is an issue with God. And this is why what he's getting ready to do at the Tower of Babel, when we hit Genesis 10:11 in just a few moments, they have transgressed boundaries again because they're trying to pursue that which God has not prescribed. We'll pick that up, all right? The second point under number 1 is the command to not eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and we know that this is exactly what happens now. They are reaching for more than God. Again, they're transgressing boundaries. We'll get to that as we move forward here. Roman numeral 2. So again, I want to look at these 3 divine human rebellions, and I got a word here: power grabs. Because I think that's what's happening. Like humans are power grabbing. They're grabbing for power. They're transgressing boundaries. Okay? They're wanting more than God has, again, He has prescribed. And the divine beings do the same. And so God is like, no, the heavens are for you divine beings, the earth is for you human beings, and you're not to do this mixture and this compromise. But the 3 divine human rebellions are their power grabs, and inside of each of these rebellions we see judgments. We've talked about this, but I want to come back again. Let me hit a few things. Get to 2 Corinthians 11. We're just going to read a few scriptures as we come through here. So let's look at rebellion 1. The divine beings, we see that both, again, the rebellions were divine and human, right? There's both of those patterned and going on inside of all 3 of these rebellions. But 2 Corinthians 11, the rebellion of the divine being, that shining one, that serpent, the rebellion of persuasion and deception to try to move Adam and Eve to transgress and disobey. Okay, let's watch how that happens as we pick up this text, 2 Corinthians 11:2. Paul says, I'm jealous for you, Corinthians, with a godly jealousy. I betrothed you to one husband, that to Christ I might present you as a pure virgin. Verse 3, but I am afraid lest as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, your minds should be led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. And so this is what that serpent is after. That quote, shining one, was to move Adam and Eve to a place of transgressing, to a place of disobedience. Now, if you look down under human beings, the rebellion of Adam and Eve, they saw that the fruit was good, and they took the issue with Eve, 1 Timothy 2, and then Romans 5 with Adam. Eve was deceived, but Adam was disobedient. And if you remember, when God comes into the garden in Genesis 3, He's coming after Adam because the command was given to Adam in Genesis 2. But I think there's something here, even as you consider marriage, okay? Even as you consider your spouse, that there's the propensity of the heart of a woman to be easily deceived and for man to be easily disobedient. There's something there. And I don't quite get it completely, but perhaps it's the inclination of a female heart to be deceived and a male's heart to be disobedient, because this was the way of the garden, that Eve was deceived and Adam was disobedient. Okay, so I'll just put that before you. Let's go back under the divine beings. That there's judgment upon the serpent. And this is a future judgment. When you look at Genesis 3:15, God says, here's the judgment for you, serpent. You will, let's just read the verse, Genesis 3:15. We're going to come back and really nail this passage and unfold it in a whole session, I think, Genesis in session 7. I think it will be our last session. I think we're going to take Genesis 3:15, look at it as what's known as the mother prophecy, and carry it all the way to the book of Revelation and look how what happened. That serpent has like graduated and become mature by the time you get to Revelation 12. It's really a fascinating study of looking at how Genesis 3:15 unfolds throughout like 6,000 years of human history. Let's read the verse. I will put enmity, God, Yahweh, speaking to the serpent. I will put enmity, hatred between you, serpent, and the woman, Eve, between your seed and her seed, and he shall bruise you. The seed of the woman will bruise or crush your head, but you will bruise him or crush his heel. Okay, and we know this is a clear statement of the first, what we would call the messianic prophecy. It is that there will be one coming from the seed of the woman that will crush the head of the serpent. Okay, we're going to look at all that in a future session. But we do understand that the judgment upon that divine being, okay, that judgment upon this serpent, and I gave you some passages to look at. I believe it is bleeding toward, okay, Satan and the devil. And we've talked through some of this because of some passages in Revelation 12, even the fact Matthew 25, where it says Jesus from his own lips, he talks about that the Gehenna or the lake of fire was like, was created for Satan and his angels. It's a really interesting thing. But the fact that we see the serpent, his head is being crushed at the end. And I just see it that it's this one. It's Satan devil that is the one being crushed at the end, at what we call the eschaton. Okay? And I would encourage you to look at those passages, because he's thrown down 3 different times in the book of Revelation. And it's like, whoa. He's thrown down to the earth during the last 3.5 years of what we call Great Tribulation or Jacob's trouble. He's thrown down into the abyss for 1,000 years, Satan, this serpent. Okay, and then he's thrown into the lake of fire in Revelation 20. So this is Messiah crushing him at the end. Again, you know, if you crush the head, right, it's dealt with. And we understand that the new heavens and the new earth and restoration of all things comes forth, because this messianic prophecy called the mother prophecy of Genesis 3:15 is playing itself out all the way to the end. Just a really beautiful thing. Okay. Let's move to the human beings. We just looked at the rebellion of Adam and Eve. Now the judgment upon Adam and Eve was the toil from the curse. Kirsten's getting ready to find that out. She's great with child. Karen is child number 4. Anybody else in here pregnant? Or you don't know, maybe? Tina, we good? She's like, yeah, we real good. But the toil, the part of the judgment and the curse even related to mankind, Adam and Eve. And then we have the driving away, right, in Genesis 3. At the end of Genesis 3, part of the judgment from God is that Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden, right? And they're driven away from His divine presence, and they're driven, how did I say that? They are driven away from the tree of life. And the tree of life would have been the place where they would have perpetuated, life. But now they have no access to the tree. And they're being driven from the very divine presence of God. This is part of judgment. And so anyway, there's a lot there. I just list that. You can reread Genesis 3. Pick that up. But we also looked at, even though there's rebellion on a human scale, God comes with judgment, but He doesn't just come with judgment. He comes with promise. And the promise is that the offspring of the woman would come and crush the serpent and bring restoration to the earth. So God, if you look at the scriptures as a mirror, Genesis 1 through 3 is like, you see it again in Revelation 20 to 22. It's like this mirror that the good of the beginning is being played out in the restoration of all things at the end. And so there's this promise that's going to unfold. And it just reminds you of that statement that even in judgment, God remembers mercy. That even in judgment, He gives promise of a future hope. And I tell you, we need to keep this in mind as we're dealing with people. As you minister to your children, keep that in mind. That even though you need a whooping, I love you, and we give hope. We give a sense of promise even in the midst of judgment. Just keep that. Rebellion number 2. Humans, so in rebellion 1, the humans want to be like the gods, Genesis 3:5. And again, you can go back and listen to those teachings. Those things were covered well. In rebellion 2, the humans want to live through the gods. So there's unsanctioned marriages going on. Divine sons of God are coming down, as we taught it, and they are taking to themselves. They saw that the women were good and they took wives for themselves. David did an excellent teaching of talking about patriarchal, is that right? Yeah. Authority that a father would have had to give his daughter over to these divine beings, perhaps to escape the Genesis 5. We think about Skid Row. David called it death row. Genesis 5, and such and such, and he died. And such and he died. And such and he died. And he died. And he died. Genesis 5 is this conclusion of death just the way God promised it. And could it be that these fathers are wanting to prolong life? They're wanting to prolong life, perhaps, that these divine beings, maybe our daughters will have grandchildren. They did. And they're called the Nephilim, giants in the land. Okay, and that just it's a wonky thing, man, but you've got to deal with all the texts that we've looked at. So that rebellion number 2 is human and trying to live through the gods, trying to perhaps prolong life and not, have to visit death row of Genesis 5. Maybe we can find an ingenious way to do it differently. And isn't this always our way? It's pride and arrogance that we would try to transgress boundaries and seek and ask and desire the blessing. Come on, think about this. The blessing is in obedience. Even the way God came to Israel. It's crazy when you look at the blessings and the curses of Deuteronomy 28. There's 14 verses of blessings to Israel if you will obey. And then he gives 60 verses on, but here are the curses if you disobey. And so we know that God's desire is that we be a submissive, obedient people, that we walk in the boundaries that He set. It's critical for us. When I used to do a teaching, and I really believe it holds weight, I would come into a group of teenagers, and I had an umbrella. And I would say this, if we'll stay under God's authority, meaning that anything under the umbrella is under God's authority, I said, we will have a sense of protection, not always, because there's real martyrdom, but we will have a sense of protection from the adversary and his ways, etc. Okay, you can't take that too far because, we know things, but I took the umbrella and I put it out over here. I said, guys, what you don't want to do is come out from under God's authority and transgress boundaries. You don't want to come out from under His authority and move into a place of disobedience. We want to live in submission and obedience and trust that the goodness of God will cover us. This is a daily prayer over my family for years. I pray physical and spiritual protection over my kids. And we hope that they will walk in submission and obedience to God. Right? Because this is the place of blessing and protection as we walk with God. But there's also righteous suffering, right? And we're not exempt from future persecution and suffering for that which is right. So that's a truth there. I don't want to overstep that. Okay. We've kind of, rebellion 2, let me just pick up this second point under the divine beings, the judgment upon the sons of God. And I want to go back and read those again just to see them one more time because I really think this is important. These sons of God that were given, as things graduated through Jewish literature, they were known as angels in the New Testament. David did a teaching on that. But look at 2 Peter 2 with me. I want to make sure just to hit this one more time. 2 Peter 2 and Jude 6. I really think this is important to see that because of the rebellion of persuasion and the pursuit of the daughters of men that they saw the daughters of men as good and they took them unto themselves. They produced what we know as the Nephilim, the giants. What is the judgment for those sons of God? They would have been divine beings in the heavens that came down to take daughters of men. I know it's like, what? But we've worked through that. I think we've talked about it enough that indeed is what's going on in the text. That there is judgment for those sons, divine beings that what are called the sons of Elohim, that we've, again, worked through for 3 or 4 sessions now, 3 sessions. And the judgment is this, 2 Peter 2, I'm in 1 Peter. 2 Peter 2, 4. For if God did not spare angels, I would say the sons of Elohim, when they sinned, but He cast them into hell. Now, this is not Gehenna, lake of fire. This is the word Tartaros. It's the word it's like the bottom of the pit in a place called the abyss or Sheol. Okay, that would have been the region. They were cast into that pit and committed to pits of darkness reserved for future judgment at day of the Lord when Jesus comes. So think, since Genesis 6, those sons of Elohim, those angels listed here, they have been in pits of darkness for thousands of years, awaiting future judgment. Okay, let's pick it up in Jude 6. And angels or sons of God, sons of Elohim, who did not keep their own domain. You see this? They did not stay in the domain of the Spirit, in the heavens. They left their own domain, abandoned their proper abode. They abandoned their proper abode of the heavens and came among the daughters of men. It's transgressing boundaries is what's going on. It says God has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day of the Lord, where they'll be judged at that time when Jesus comes. All right? So I just wanted to show that there's rebellion and judgment, both the divine and human beings. Rebellion 1, now rebellion 2 for sure. One other piece that we worked through some is the Nephilim. Like these giants in the land that were produced by this divine human, these giants called the Nephilim, they would have been disembodied spirits, right? If they died, they did die in the flood, and their disembodied spirits would have lived on. Because you have now divine and human, like they created some kind of monster. And so that spirit would not have died. What happens to those spirits? And this is in Jewish literature, particularly like what's known as Second Temple Judaism, this Jewish literature, the readings between the Old and New Testament, they would have clearly begun to identify Jewish sages. They would have clearly identified these Nephilim. Their death through the flood was the origin of demons. Okay, so I'll leave it there, but I think it's important just to state that again. Again, you can go back and listen through our materials, and it will highlight those things more in detail. Okay, let's look at the human beings under rebellion 2, and I'm going to pitch it to David. The rebellion of desire and compliance to prolong life and escape death row. We talked about that. The judgment of flood and death, which is Genesis 6 and 7. Foreshadows an eschatological or an end-time judgment. Now, if you didn't get a chance, session 3 was a podcast David did with the voice. Maybe some of y'all don't know him. He's right here. Raise your hand, John. He's a scientist among us. No, John, this is the voice that you heard, John William Blackwell. I think y'all did just a fabulous job. The best part is I was at the beach chilling. No, really, man, I was just really, really hit the nail on the head. But you notice how they carried the flood language into the prophets and into the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24, and over into 2 Peter 3. And I just think the way that they just handle the scriptures, I mean, I just love it. I just sitting there listening on my way home from the beach. It just blessed me so much observing. So the judgment of the flood, foreshadowing is that the right word? Foreshadowing something future. Is that right? Okay. Thank you, Cameron. It's foreshadowing a future judgment that's coming at the end of days. As Jesus says, as it was in the days of Noah, it will be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. Luke 21, Luke 17, and Matthew 24. Okay. What is the promise? The promise coming out of that second rebellion. Notice that the promises were not committed to the divine beings, but to human beings. It's like God has this soft spot in His heart for humans. That we will even judge angels. I think Hebrews says. What's that all about? I don't know. But the promise that God gives that there'll be an offspring that will come in rebellion 1 and will crush the head of the serpent. The second rebellion of the humans is the promise of everlasting covenant with Noah, his offspring, and living creatures. So what y'all have heard me do in the first 2 rebellions is just kind of highlight where we've been. Add a little bit here, a little depth, a little deep description to some things. Maybe that's beneficial. But now what we want to do is we're going to turn completely to Genesis 10:11. And David's going to do a little bit of historical background on this table of nations. And then I'm going to come back and deal with Rebellion 3. And we're going to carry it forward a little bit. Introduction to the origin of the Jewish narrative. David?
Okay, so I'm going to do the commercial on Genesis 10. We interrupt the regular broadcast. And I'm doing Genesis 10 because you guys know that genealogies don't get no love in the Bible. Skip. You know, open up Chronicles, you're just like, oh, I'm going to go ahead over into chapter 3, 5, 6, move on, So we need to get through this just really quick. But it's really important, and it's actually, I think it's really essential as we move forward into 11. So in Genesis 10, it starts out with again, what we talked about, a new section, these big sections in Genesis, literary sections, and it has these are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, Japheth, the sons of Noah, right? And so this starts a new segment. Before that, we had Noah, right? So, and is outlining the sons that are born to these three after the flood, obviously. And what we see, the features here, I just want to, if you look in the notes, we'll just read a couple of these here.
I need some glasses, man.
I know, sorry. Try to keep it small to keep it on the page. From these, the coastlands of the nations were separated. I'm in verse 5, sorry. The coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. If you skip ahead to verse 18, I'm just highlighting a couple verses here, and you'll see why in a minute. Afterward, the families of the Canaanite were spread abroad. So we have this separated, then they're spread abroad, and then in 25, the name of this one son here is Peleg, which for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan, but his name actually means divided. And so he's actually a prophetic figure, kind of like the tradition around Methuselah. His name means when he dies, it will come. And it's connected to the flood judgment. This guy's name means divided, separated. So there's this thing that's happening. There's a separation, a division that's happening, and as these genealogies are unfolding, right? And so I'm just trying to point out the language again and again, over and over, is separation, division, or we get into chapter 11, scattering. And so it's something that happens not on the basis of men just deciding that they're just going to do whatever, but it's actually in the passive. It's like, it's something that is done, like forced upon them, okay? And so, if you look in verse 32, this is kind of like this is our family history, all of us in this room, okay? I mean, humanity, but this is 32. These are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies, by their nations. Out of these, the nations were separated on the earth after the flood. This is the first reference in the Bible to the nations, the Gentiles that we actually, and we see that over and over of, the biblical framework is Gentiles and Israel later after the covenant. But, so we're not going to read the genealogy, okay? Even though that would be showing it like ultimate love, is like we're going to take the time and read all this. But the general boundaries of God's division, they outline Japheth is to the north and western regions. They separate out to the north and western regions, including Asia Minor and Europe. Ham is in Egypt and North Africa and his lineage. And then the nations of Shem are in Mesopotamia and Arabia. And there's a total of 70 nations. And if you look on I did the little chart, you can actually go through and all of these number each of the sons. And so the tradition is there's 70 nations in total coming out of this table of nations, okay? And so if you look, well, let's just look at the next thing. So the table comes up again, not just in Genesis, but it comes up again when you open up Chronicles. First Chronicles, it outlines, it's another book that starts out with the genealogy that we all skip over, but it starts out with Adam, and it goes all the way up, and it outlines the sons. And then it kind of hangs out over, it's a brief list of Japheth and Ham, and then it really starts digging in on Shem. And then it hits Abraham, and it really just starts digging in on Abraham's lineage, and it's going from Adam to Israel. And it really emphasizes Israel as the center point, okay? So it's kind of like, from the perspective of the Bible, this table of nations has past, from Genesis, that thing, presently in the sense of like during Chronicles, during Israel's history. And then also the table functions for eschatology, for the future. When you, in these passages, like in Ezekiel 30 and 38, 39, it's talking about the idea of Gog and Magog. You guys maybe have heard that before. It uses these nations as the reference points for the geography. And similarly, Daniel 11 and Isaiah 66, which is a big one about all of these nations from these different regions of the world are coming to worship in the age to come in Jerusalem and being gathered by Yahweh to come and worship. And it actually points out a lot of these same nations. So the point is that this table provides geography, and it continued to provide geography for Israel. Okay? If you think about it, in Jesus' time, there wasn't geography class, So your class was Tanakh, your class was Torah, and Torah provided you with maps and geography and understanding of the world and nations and these things, right? And so this became the concept for it. And the table continued on through Jewish literature, and I'm not going to hang on this very long, but in the book of Jubilees, which was a book around the 2nd century BC, okay? So this was around when Jesus was here. This book it actually covers almost like a commentary, so to speak, exposition of Genesis and forward. And there's within this book there are accounts about this Genesis 10. It corresponds and kind of has a lot of the same content. And so they're still using the same geography from Genesis 10. And so if you look at this map here on the left, you can see, you guys like pictures, right? So I like pictures in books. So I had to put the pictures here. The map, you see the sons of Japheth in the north and into Europe regions. And you see like Shem, his region is Mount Zion, Mount Sinai, that's this area in Arabia. You see Eden, according to their framework, they actually thought Eden was at the furthest eastern extent on the right side of the circle. And they actually thought the circle itself was surrounded by water. So there's waters on the edges of like oceans and seas on the edges of everything. And then Ham is in northern Africa, and his lineage is in northern Africa. But this is like an ancient recreation of their ancient map idea. And so I'll just briefly, in the book of Jubilees, there's accounts about Noah's sons dividing the land, and Noah, gives them their portions, and he actually pronounces a curse on any son that would transgress, kind of, so to speak, we'll take the theme forward, transgress the boundary of their portion that they were given. This is in Jewish tradition. This isn't biblical. But they would, if they took one of their brother's portions, there would be a curse on them. And it actually invokes and talks about the day of judgment where God will judge them for doing that. And so in this tradition, the son that is cursed in Genesis 9, Canaan, that we talked about, Ham's son, Canaan, who's cursed by his grandpa, right, Noah, that he actually, when they go into the land after the Tower of Babel, he says, actually, I want this piece of land, which stretches from Lebanon down to the border of Egypt, and I want that area, which actually that area is the land of Israel, which is the land of Shem. And so, and all his father and his sons and his brothers are like, don't do this because, there's a curse, and that if you do this, that all of your children will be totally destroyed in the land, right? Well, if you think about that, when Israel opens up, as you move forward in the Bible, it's the issue of the Canaanites. When Israel goes into the land, it's like, why would God basically say, I want you guys to do genocide? You know, this is a big problem in Old Testament theology, because people say, how can God actually command genocide? You know, of killing wiping out all of the Canaanites, right? But this tradition kind of helps maybe give some explanations for, it's an extra biblical thing, but it can kind of give maybe some reasons why in Jewish tradition, why that could contribute to it being something that God is upholding the transgression of boundaries and bringing about account for that. And so the point what I'm trying to say is that even in Jewish tradition moving forward, Genesis 10, the table of nations, still becomes the axis for people orienting around, this is the map of the world. And this is where all the Gentiles are and where they're from. And it actually is informed in even, I think it could even play out in how the apostles orient their mission is according to some of these ancient Genesis 10 nations. And so Paul actually mostly works with the sons of Japheth, you know, not only, but anyways. And then, so that's Genesis 10 for the genealogy thing. But I just wanted to mention one other thing as we move into 11, and David's going to pick back up here, is that, you know, I think we were talking about this earlier in the week, but if you guys remember, the first week we were talking about Genesis 1, and in the garden was this mountain, you know, and Eden there, and it's the place of God's presence. It's this mountain, Ezekiel 28, right? And even the counterfeits of this happening later on with the Tower of Babel is these ziggurats are built as, you know, counterfeit mountains to encounter God, right? And so this is what is happening in Genesis 11. It's not just that God doesn't like tall buildings. It's that they're actually trying to forge a connection with the gods again and recreate what existed in the beginning in Genesis, right? Recreate that where the mountain, they had access to the very presence of God in the mountain from the garden. They're trying to recreate that and fabricate it on their own strength and in their own way. And so this, you actually see some of those desires happening from the beginning. I mean, right after men are kicked out of the garden, you have like Cain and Abel offering sacrifices. Well, why are they offering sacrifices? Who told them about sacrifice? Are they trying to atone for sins? It's the word they use actually there is just worship. And so they're trying to worship God and just have connection with God. Again, it's like this longing for it's like you grow up with your dad who was in the garden with God. You know what I'm saying? And it's like, tell me what that was like, you know? And so these guys are doing that. And you see that kind of traced through, but Genesis 11 is this forging the connection between heaven and earth in their own strength to recreate those conditions where, you know, that was there before the flood, and that, you know, this desire for kind of former greatness and the God dwelling with men thing in their own strength is what, you know, God comes and brings the correction to what's happening. And this actually, I think, David and I were talking this week, I think this has a lot of connections with idolatry. Later on in the Bible, Because, the first and second commandments are two different commandments, right? You shall have no other gods before me, right? But you should also have no other idols. You don't worship, and you don't construct forms of worship in ways that are wrong, right? They're two different things. It's not just one command in the Ten Commandments. It's two different commands. So they're actually constructing an attempt for worship, attempt for connection with the gods that is not sanctioned. And later in the story, God says, actually, I have a way for you to connect with me, Israel. I have a way. It is through the tabernacle. It's through the temple. And all of those things, tabernacle, temple, if you read through, they're all talking about in language of garden, like the things that are sewn into the curtains, and all of the temple edifice itself has imagery of Eden and of mountains and of this is right through all the kind of boring instructions of have what's his name guy, the artisan guy, create this out of this, and we kind of okay, yeah. But this is it's kind of bringing the garden back, so to speak, in a temporary way of access to God, And so those become the sanctioned places of worship that God chooses in the future. So pitch it back to you.
Well, in light of that, what's the rebellion going on? And so I want to pick this up. David, I think, just really work through that. I probably going to more deal with the judgment in terms of, in the third rebellion at the Tower of Babel, we have humans seeking to access the gods. Okay, so it's after 2,000 years, it's a third rebellion, and it's another attempt at doing it their way, transgressing boundaries. I just threw this in here, so it's my language, it's not Yahweh's language. But let's read this paragraph. It's almost as though Yahweh says, it's been 2,000 years. Again, Genesis 1 to 11, 2,000 years. It's been 2,000 years and 3 strikes, y'all. Divine beings, sons of God, and human beings, nations, you're out. 3 strikes and you're out, right? And then 3 outs and you change the guard and you come back in, and it's time to hit, and it's time for somebody, I'm talking about baseball. And so God, it's almost after 2,000 years, God's like, okay, strike 1, out 1, strike 2, out 2, strike 3, out 3. I'm now going to come and deal with you nations. Not only does he drive them from his presence in Genesis 3, bring the flood in Genesis 6, now he's going to separate and scatter the nations. And this is what we want to address, setting up the Jewish narrative. Let me read this again. It's almost as though Yahweh says, it's been 2,000 years and 3 strikes, y'all. Divine beings, sons of God, and human beings, nations, you're out. Y'all don't want my rule, my way. Since y'all will not steward what I've entrusted to you, here's what I'm going to do. This is kind of the idea. Now, here's how I'm going to handle you after 3 strikes and 3 outs. And so the divine beings, because of their rebellious past of interference, wicked persuasions, and transgressions of 3 and 6, we're seeing it play out again in Genesis 11. And then their judgment. What is the judgment of the divine beings in regards to Genesis 11? So this is where it's going to get tight up in here. Okay, let's go to Deuteronomy 4. I want you to see how God not only separates the nations, and scatters the nations at Babel, but there's something bigger going on. And I want us to read just this passage here. This is an instruction to Israel, Deuteronomy 4. But look what he says to Israel, and we get some language that helps us understand what happens at Babel. Deuteronomy 4:19. Beware, Israel, lest you lift up your eyes to heaven and see the sun, moon, and stars, and all the host of heaven. What are the host of heaven? They're divine beings, right? From Genesis 2:1 that we've discussed in session 1. So beware lest you lift up your eyes to heaven and see the sun, moon, stars, and all the host of heaven, the divine beings, and be drawn away and worship them and serve them. Those which Yahweh, your Elohim, Israel, has allotted to all the peoples under the whole, what does it say? Under the whole heaven. And so God is going to, at Babel, ascribe these sons of Elohim over those nations, and we understand 70 nations. When God separates and scatters the nations, He places them as an allotment under the divine sons of God. From this passage, and we're going to look at another one in just a moment. Just grasp that for a moment. Now let's in light of that, let's reread Psalm 82, because I think that this will really help as well, that the way that these sons of God, these divine beings were allotted to steward the nations, 70 nations, we find their end and how they have not stewarded the nations the way Yahweh desired them to steward the nations. They're going to steward the nations in an unfair, wicked way. So let's look at Psalm 82. God, Yahweh Elohim, takes His stand in His own congregation, which we've labeled as the Divine Council, session 1, I think it was. And Yahweh judges in the midst of these sons of God. We talked about this. How long, and then he speaks to this divine council of the sons of Elohim. These ones that are allotted over the nations, according to Deuteronomy 4:19, God is saying this now. How long will you, sons of Elohim, how long will you, divine beings, judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? And he's like, vindicate the weak and fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and destitute, rescue the weak and needy, deliver them out of the hand of the wicked. And what you see is these divine beings have allotment and stewardship over the nations. I'm not talking about in ancient times. I'm talking about even today. When you go to places, David and Kirsten, to Nepal, they have high places where the monks hang out. And there's the worship of these other gods. You know, we're not talking about way back 1,000, 2,000 years ago, that this is real even today. And so, verse 5, they do not know. See, the sons of men, the human beings, they don't know, nor do they understand. They walk about in darkness, and all the foundations of the earth are shaken. Why? Because you have not stewarded the nations in a way that I've entrusted them to you in righteousness. You've done it in a wicked way, sons of Elohim. Verse 6, I said, and Jesus quotes this in John chapter 10. That'll really mess with your head a little bit, okay? Jesus quotes Psalm 82:6. But I said, Yahweh says, you are gods, right? You are the sons, you are gods, and all of you are sons of the Most High. Nevertheless, you will die like men, sons of Adam, and you will fall like any one of the princes. Verse 8, arise, O Yahweh Elohim, and judge the earth, for it is you who possess all the nations, and He will possess all nations through this allotment with Israel we're getting ready to turn to in the age to come. Because even Israel had failed at the way they stewarded what God entrusted to them. Okay, so this is a big point, that God allotted the nations to the sons of God. In other words, if there's 70 nations, then there are perhaps 70 Elohim. I don't know that for sure. When you look like at Daniel chapter 10, the prince of Persia, the prince of Greece. These are entities, divine beings over, we might call it spiritual warfare, but these are entities that have reign and rule over geographical regions, over nations. Okay? So we need to make sure to make these connect points. All right? Reread Daniel 10. That'd be good homework. All right. So let's get down to the human beings. This rebellious reach for divine presence that David was just talking about, the human beings are reaching beyond what God would allow them, and they're wanting to build this ziggurat into the heavens so that there can be some sense of Eden again. All right. Point 2 under human beings. There's judgment of separating, dividing, scattering, and dispersing the nations from Babel according to language, race, and land boundaries. And I would encourage you to look at those passages, and even Acts 17 really adds an interesting understanding that again, there's the allotment of the nations there's a separating and scattering of the nations with boundaries set by Yahweh. All right? And we know them according to the table of nations, Genesis 10, as 70 nations. So what's the judgment of Yahweh? The judgment of Yahweh is given the nations. Not only does he commit these divine beings, sons of God, over as allotment over the nations, but Yahweh also is giving the nations over to the evil inclinations of their heart's desires. So I want you to think through this. David alluded to this, didn't go into tremendous detail, but like Genesis 6:5, it says that the intent of their heart now is to do wickedness and evil in light of these divine beings come down. There's an exponential growth of wickedness and the intent of man's heart. By the time you get to Genesis 8:21, it says the intent of your heart from your youth is to do evil. So I want to pick up this passage because I think it's really important. We may not even get to the divine election. Maybe it's just a good setup for next week, of course, session 5. But let's go to Romans chapter 1. I wonder, have we read Romans 1 in light of Genesis 11? So let's get there. I'm not going to pick up the gospel portion, okay? And I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God unto salvation. In it's the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. Righteous man shall live by faith. Praise the Lord. Yes. But we're going to pick it up. I'm going to actually just read through 18 to 32. And I want us to see that at the table of nations this time of Genesis 11, that there's something else going on there as well. That God is, 3 times you're going to see it. He gives over the nations to their heart's desire toward evil inclination. I want to tell you now, He'll do that for us. If we stay in a pattern, He'll allow us to go in the evil inclination of our own hearts. It's a sobering reality that we need to hear this word. We call it all under grace, beloved. Yes, God's gracious, but He'll whoop your hiney, right? God will come deal with us if we stay in patterns of moving toward evil inclination. And you know that in your own life as we walk with the Lord. But look at this, Romans 1:18. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And I believe it looks like that when he starts talking about giving them over, it looks like this is a portion of what's happening in Genesis 11, that God's giving them over to their heart's desire. Let's watch what He gives them over to. Verse 23, they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for the image of, in the form of corruptible man. There's some kind of idolatry going on, 23. Verse 24, therefore God gave them over. So I'm saying, I don't want to just be general about this. Of course, it's Jewish condemnation. Again, it's God bringing God bringing condemnation and, quote, correction to the nations, but God gives them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity, and their bodies might be dishonored, and they exchange the truth of God for a lie. Verse 26, for this reason God gave them over to degrading passions, for their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. Now, you know we're talking about women with women. Now, have you connected this? I want you to think about this. I was pondering, meditating on this today. That if God says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, you cannot fill the earth and obey that initial command through homosexuality. I'm not going to linger there. I'm saying ponder this, beloved. This is why God has an issue with homosexuality and lesbianism. This is the reason why. Because you cannot procreate. Just like human divine beings are not to have sexual union, so it's the same. It should not be Adam and Steve, but it's Adam and Eve. Okay, y'all, that's for the teenagers when I used to speak at the boys out at Western High School football team. Anyway, okay, God gave them over to degrading passions, and you start reading that verse 27, there's men abandoning the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another. Men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. Verse 28, and they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer. God gave them over to a depraved mind, to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife. You hear the commandments here, don't you? Deceit, malice, gossips, slanders, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil. And my goodness, how did he put this one in there? The end of verse 30. Disobedient to parents. It's very real. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but they give hearty approval to those who practice them. And we're seeing this in our nation all over the place. When you not only practice wickedness, but you give hearty approval to levels of wickedness and unrighteousness in our culture. This is what we're seeing all around us. But this, I believe, goes back to God gives them over. He gives them over. He gives them over. Last passage, and I'm not going to get to Jewish election tonight. Deuteronomy chapter 32. Let's just peer into this. And I think what we'll do this week is David and I will come back and start picking up some of this in our follow-up podcast on Wednesday. But let's look at this last point, the judgment of allotting and disinheriting the nations. Now, Deuteronomy 4:19, God gives the sons of Elohim allotment over the nations. In Deuteronomy 32:8, He gives the sons of men. He gives human beings over to the nations. Over to the sons of Elohim. It's like 4:19 and 32:8. You know what you ought to do? Take Deuteronomy 4:19, Deuteronomy 32:8, they're listed here, and write them on a piece of paper and stare at it for a few hours. And then it'll start making sense. But many times it doesn't because we're just staring at it. I tell you, when you write it down, it becomes, I'm going to close this because it's 8:02. Let's look at this passage, Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. There's a lot here. This is the Song of Moses, a really clear end-time eschatological passage, okay? But Deuteronomy 32:8. When the Most High, this will be Elyon, mentioned in passages like Psalm 82 that we read earlier. But when the Most High, Elyon is the Hebrew, gave the nations their inheritance. He's speaking of Genesis 11. That God gave the nations, those 70 table of nations, He gave them their inheritance. What is their inheritance? He's going to list it here. When He separated, see that language of Genesis 10:11? He separated the sons of Adam, man, those 70 nations. He separated them and He set the boundaries of the peoples. How? According to their inheritance. What's their inheritance? Here it is. According to the number of the sons, and what does yours say? Israel. Okay. So, I did this about 5 years ago, and it was a little hard and a little unnerving, but I began with David and many others. This is very well known among scholarship that this is a very bad translation from the Masoretic text. That you should take this word, because it doesn't even make sense, first of all, because there are no sons of Israel at the table of nations, Genesis 10:11. Mark out Israel, and you ought to put God there. It's the sons of Elohim. That God gave and allotted the sons of Adam over to the sons of Elohim. And He gave the sons of Elohim over to the sons of men. That God is saying this: I want you to steward the nations, sons of Elohim, these divine beings, and nations. I want you to function under and be stewarded by these sons of Elohim. That's what's going on. Now, if your head's spinning, okay, that's good. Because I'm telling you, this came not to me, but to many scholars, but like 5 years ago for me. And then it starts working on you. And it starts working on you. And it was just in the last year that this thing really started gelling and like making really clear sense. Because if we don't grasp this, then we will not understand that what God does next, watch this. When the 70 nations at the Tower of Babel, when He scatters and disperses them all over and He puts them under the allotment of the sons of Elohim, God says, but here, now, Abram, I am your Elohim, right? I am the Lord your God. I'm not allotted the nations to you, Abraham. You are mine and I am yours. Let's read verse 9 of Deuteronomy 32 and I'll be done. Look what he says, because this really helps frame it. Let's start verse 9. For the Lord's portion is His people. Jacob is the allotment of His inheritance. So God disinherits the nations to the sons of Elohim, these 70, right? But He says, but I am your Elohim, I am your God, Abram, and God then, of course, begins the development of what we know as Israel, the Jewish people. And God is now binds His name over 200 times in the Old Testament as the God of Israel. So whatever He's doing with Israel, we need to get our eyes wide open and understand it. And this will help us really understand the Jewish narrative. So what does He do? In the midst of all this Tower of Babel and all this craziness, He calls one man out, Abraham. One. I did say I was going to be done. I got to read this last verse. Look at Joshua 24. One verse. Joshua 24:2, and I'll pray. When God calls Abram out from this region of Mesopotamia, He calls him to the land of Canaan, right? That's going to become the land of Israel. But look what's going on with Abraham, or Abram. Joshua 24:2. Joshua said to all the people, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. Thus says Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel. From ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river, namely Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. But God says, you for me and I'm for you, Abraham. And I'm going to build a nation through which I'm going to bring the seed, Messiah. Jesus was not Ethiopian. He's not American. He's not Mexican. Jesus, Messiah, is a Jew. Father, we just ask that you would help us. I think, Lord, these are hard and deep things, but they're really not. I ask you to help us understand. I ask, God, that maybe by the Spirit of God through your word, that, Lord, we have some sense of backstory of Genesis 1-11 to begin now opening up this Jewish narrative. Father, give us insight into what you're doing with Abraham. Give us insight what you're going to do with Israel. And God, that it would make sense all the way into the New Testament, all the way to the end of the age, all the way into the age to come, when you restore all things through this nation, Israel. Help us, God, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.